So this is definitely going to be a more laid back video, because I'm pretty uptight in all my other videos. But that doesn't mean that it's not to be taken seriously. This is just a little fun video that I threw together because my other videos are taking longer to edit than I thought they would. But first, 2 preliminary caveats, okay? Because that's my favorite thing, is preliminary and caveats. Number 1, I'm saying silly with tongue in cheek. Okay, there's no malice intended here. Like I said, this is a light-hearted video, okay? But it's all in good fun. Number 2, I myself have said many a silly thing during my tenure as a YouTube brewer, okay? But for that stuff, there is another video where I actually talk about all of my personal Let's Wine About It mistakes, and that's right here, so click it and watch it, but after this video. So let's all just sit back, relax, and review 6 silly things that have been said in the home brewing community. Number 1, don't use a recipe. Yeah, you're like, what? Why? Who said that? Well, really, it was just one person once in a home brewing forum, and they said it to me, and it just really irritated me. So now I'm devoting a whole section of this video to that person. I'm not going to tag them or anything, that's mean. I asked for a recipe for banana wine, and somebody replied and said, don't use a recipe. Would a chef ever consult a recipe when constructing their award-winning dish? They would create their own recipe. Okay, I grant that, but I am not a chef. And any beginner or intermediate winemaker is not the chef level of expertise in winemaking. And so recipes are extraordinarily helpful and important to use. In fact, if you're a beginner brewer and you're not using a recipe, you're making a fundamental mistake. You need a recipe with a proven track record. I myself, in my earlier days, have tried to create something delicious all on my own, and 99 times out of 100, it doesn't work. So anyway, I'll get off the high horse now because most people don't say don't use a recipe. There's just this one person that I had to have my piece about it. Number 2, I don't like wine. Now, this is not a thing that home brewers say or anybody who makes wine says. This is just related and it's really annoying, and I'm gonna talk about it here. The reason this is so silly is because there is no such thing as the taste of wine or the flavor of mead. Even with mead, where you have that unifying factor of honey, there are so many different types of honey that to talk about what honey tastes like assumes that you're talking about actually one specific kind of honey, not honey generally. When it comes to wine, the even broader category, there's just no unifying feature except for alcohol that correlates with every single type of wine, that unifies everything within that category of wine. So when you say you don't like wine, you probably mean you don't like commercially produced red wines or white wines, which are generally dry. It doesn't mean that you don't like wine in totality, because as I can tell you from my years now making wine and mead, you can make any kind of flavor profile you want, whether that be dry or sweet or oaky or fruity or tangy or more acidic or less acidic. There are so many possibilities that you're closing yourself off to by this blanket statement, I don't like wine. Number 3, elitism explains why home brewers don't use bread yeast. Now, I'm not going to name names about who said this, but I think you know who I'm talking about. But let me say as a caveat, I really do think that the beginner home brewer on your very first experiment with making a wine or a mead, you can use bread yeast. Sure, go for it. If you have it on hand and you watched a YouTube video that has grocery level ingredients and you got it all together, make your stuff and see how it comes out. Just know that if you don't like the exact way that the wine tastes or the mead tastes, know that it'll probably be better if you use a wine yeast. All of that is to say that the reason home brewers don't use bread yeast is because bread yeast is worse than wine yeast on almost any single metric. Bread yeast doesn't flocculate as well as wine yeast, doesn't compact as well at the bottom of a bucket or a carboy, making clarification more difficult. And wine yeast produce a superior flavor profile to bread yeast, 99 times out of 100. Now, obviously, you can say, well, I made bread yeast all this time and it's always turned out good. Yes, but it would be fallacious to infer from that it couldn't have been better with wine yeast. You actually don't know that until you use wine yeast, right? Now, somebody out there who's followed along with me this whole time is going to point to that bread yeast wine yeast test that I did and published, where I actually concluded that the bread yeast wasn't inferior to the wine yeast, that result really needs to be tossed out because I used a super acidic juice, pomegranate juice, which just masks over any differences that the yeast make. You can't really tell what impact they have. So ignore that. A better indicative result would be when I experimented with yeast on my hard cider with Sean. That's a funny video, so watch that video. And the best one was a tailored wine yeast. I think it was actually an ale yeast. But the point is, it was a brewing yeast, and it was much better than the bread yeast. So there's your proof. Homebrewers are unified in this wisdom, though, and it's not because of elitism. That's silly. That's just a silly thing. Number 4, time heals all brews. No, it doesn't. Okay, my impression of what aging wines does is that it mellows out those harsher flavors. Off flavors tend to dissipate, and the fruity flavors or the flavors you're looking for tend to solidify, so that wines do get better as they age. But the idea that you can bottle up a terrible tasting wine and then a year or 2 later it's going to taste great, that's just not true. There are key and fundamental mistakes that you can make along the way that will not be fixed by time. I have had wines, I'm thinking here that cran raspberry wine, that taste even more disgusting as time goes on. And that makes sense. If you didn't make the wine well to begin with, chances are it's not going to get significantly or noticeably better over time. Time isn't like magical, okay? You can't give it crap and then get awesome later. So just put in the time at the beginning. And as my favorite brew tuber from Doing the Most has said, the best policy here is to just make your wine as yummy and tasty as you can before you bottle it. And then it will get better as time goes on. Don't count on time, though, to fix your mistakes. Number 5, you have to throw away your gravity reading sample. Now, there are 2 different times in the winemaking process that this wisdom sometimes percolates. Sometimes you'll hear that when you take that initial gravity reading, you need to throw away or drink the sample that you are measuring the gravity with. You can't pour it back into your carboy or your bucket. That is silly. The idea seems to be that you risk introducing some bacteria that may have gotten into the sample, and then you pour it into the larger collection and it'll infect it. But look, if the sample can get infected prior to fermentation, then the whole must can as well. They're both open to the ambient environment and air. So this what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, okay? That's an old-timey phrase that I hate, but I had to say it once. And then the other time is after fermentation, when you actually have a full wine and you're taking a final gravity reading. There, the wisdom seems to be don't pour it back into your collection of wine, because then you could oxidize it, right? You're aggravating the liquid when you pour it in. However, while you do oxidize it just a little bit, because you introduce a little bit of oxygen, it's just a little bit. And though it is fallacious to say, well, I've always done it this way and it's never been a problem, I've always poured it back in and never had a problem. And so I really do suspect that the amount of oxygen introduced is negligible. But to each their own. This one may be perhaps the least silly of all of them, but I still think it crosses that silliness threshold. Finally, in general, anything of the form, you must do it my way. Like, you must use pectic enzyme when fermenting with fruit. You have to balance your pH or your yeast won't ferment. You have to follow TOSNA protocol to the T, or you can't use bread yeast. None of this is to say that we can't make generalizations about best practices, about the best techniques to produce the highest quality product. Once you're talking about competition level wine, yes, it absolutely makes sense that you have to be obsessively precise about the practices that you follow. But if you're talking about the level of winemaking most of us are at, which is making wine to enjoy with family and friends, there is more than one way to skin a cat, okay? That's also a phrase I don't like, but it's so vivid and it gets the message across. Just because someone else isn't following your exact method doesn't mean that they are following a bad method. Maybe it's not as good, but that doesn't mean that it's bad or that you should tell them to stop. And here's where we would do well to guard against elitism. Don't sneer at people who do things differently than you. I'm not here endorsing some sort of winemaking relativism where everything is on a par. It's not. But you need to take yourself a little less seriously if when somebody suggests a recipe that doesn't correspond exactly to yours, you freak out. Okay? Let's all just breathe and chill and realize that the end goal here is to have fun and to make people happy. And if they're doing that, if you're doing that, making wine, and you're happy, you're having fun, and people are smiling, you're doing it right. So, there you go, kids. If you've disagreed with anything I've said here, then please let me know in the comments. I'm very charitable when I talk with people. I hope that much is clear. I don't usually get my back against the wall or get aggressive. So let's chat, let's debate, let's argue it out, because I think that that's productive and good, as long as it's done in good faith. Thank you for watching. Watch all of my videos. But in the meantime, have a wonderful day.